South Korea is poised to play host to the third Summit for Democracy, aimed at strengthening solidarity among nations with shared values, starting next week. So what is on the agenda this year? What is the significance of South Korea's proactive stance to the summit? And what are pundits proposing to make the summit a permanent forum for democracies? Hope your work week is off to a good start. You're watching Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we touch upon an upcoming forum on democracy to be hosted by South Korea starting next Monday until next Wednesday. For this, I have Professor Min Jeong-hun from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy here in the studio. Professor Min, welcome back.
My pleasure always.
I also have Professor Hans Schattle from Yonsei University. Professor Schattle, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Sun-hee. Nice to see you.
Right. Professor Min, we'll start with you. Let's begin with some background information about the Summit for Democracy, including, of course, its purpose and the outcome of the previous two meetings, I believe.
Yes, the Summit for Democracy is a virtual meeting among democratic countries, and it was initiated by the Biden administration of the United States. And it is known that the goals of the summit meeting is to renew democracy at home and confront autocracies abroad. And the first summit was held in December 2021. And the three themes of the summit include defending democracy against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, and advancing respect for human rights. And the 111 countries joined the first meeting. But the first meeting also became controversial because contradictory to its themes, multiple undemocratic or the authoritarian regimes like Iraq and Pakistan joined the meeting, and it was criticized. And some argued that the Biden administration strategically invited such undemocratic countries to mobilize them for checking the rise of China and other authoritarian regimes. And the second summit was held in March 2023, and it was co-hosted by the US, South Korea, Costa Rica, Zambia, and Netherlands. And in the meeting, the participating countries organized actions to address emerging threats or challenges to democracy. And as you saw from the briefing, the third meeting will be hosted by South Korea, and it will be held on March 18th through 20th. And the main theme of the meeting is known as Democracy for Future Generations. And as you know, South Korea is pursuing global pivotal state and expresses value diplomacy to be a responsible state stakeholder in the global community. So hosting the summit would contribute South Korea to enhancing its international standing as a trustworthy, responsible, advanced democracy.
Right, and expanding perhaps on what Professor Min has just said, Professor Schattle, what is the significance of the Yoon administration's proactive stance to this particular forum, if I may?
Well, Sunny, as Professor Min just said, when President Yoon came into office, the phrase global pivotal state became a key buzzword for this government. And it left a lot of us in political science wondering just exactly what would be meant by that, how the Yoon administration would go about trying to put some meat on the bones of that statement. And I think hosting a global summit on democracy is certainly one way that they can do that. Keep in mind also that President Yoon won the election here in March of 2022, just a few days after Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's possible that, and it was a narrow victory for President Yoon as well, and it's possible that what had the effect of swinging the election in his favor was concern in this country about the need for South Korea to stand shoulder to shoulder with democracies around the world. And of course, this coincided with the Biden administration in the United States also trying to build together a stronger coalition of not only allies, but fellow democratic countries around the world. So for President Yoon and the government to stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. and with other democratic nation states is actually a way of saying, you know, here's Korea to do its part alongside the rest of the world's democracies. Now, of course, it invites a lot of critical scrutiny on the effectiveness of democracy in any country that's going to host a summit for democracy, including this one. So that can lead to some interesting conversation today as well.
Right, and I will expand on that later on then. Professor Min, there are pundits who believe that the platform has been made, but it needs to take on a greater, or play a greater significant role amid the current climate of geopolitical tensions. That being said, what would you suggest to ensure that this particular summit becomes more than just another talk shop for global leaders?
Well, basically, I think that if the summit meeting want to get a global significance, it needs to establish tangible agendas that member states can be interested together, like the economic and trade issues in the APEC summit meeting. But this Summit for Democracy, includes over 110 countries, and they have different political, economic, and cultural backgrounds. And academically speaking, the term democracy could have various definitions and not easy to clarify and have a consensus about how to defend the democracy against authoritarianism and how to fight against corruption and how to protect and improve human rights. For example, think about the supposed situation where regarding human rights, there are some countries in the summit who got some kind of human rights violations in the country. And then how can the participating countries in the summit reach an agreement in the summit to criticize human rights violation and protect human rights in the countries? And most countries in the summit also have some diplomatic and economic connections with China, Russia, and the Middle East countries. And I don't think that in the summit they would be able to criticize the undemocratic countries for any reason, like political oppression, corruption, and human rights violations in the countries. So these examples show that the Summit for Democracy could be a kind of political and diplomatic symbolic meeting among democratic countries, or more precisely, like-minded countries. Of course, they could talk about ODA and projects that the members of developed countries could offer for members of developing countries in the summit. In addition, it should be noted that the summit meeting was initiated by Biden administration, which want to utilize democratic values and principles like freedom, rule of law, and human rights to mobilize its allies and partners in order to maintain its leadership in the global community. So, simply speaking, as one of the developed democracies in the summit, South Korea can take more active roles and responsibilities just in helping developing countries in the summit.
Right, and staying with the same question, Professor Schattle, what are some ways to make this particular platform more permanent?
Well, for starters, as we've been discussing, so far the summit has been hosted and held by individual countries. So the baton has been passed, at least for this year, say, from the U.S., which had organized it with several partners, to South Korea, which is taking the lead. It's possible that the next best move for the summit, for it to evolve further, would be to set up a permanent secretariat. There are a couple of different models that could follow. It could be a secretariat that would rotate from country to country, and participating countries could line up maybe in 5-year intervals, taking turns and rotating as host. Another model would be to have a secretariat that would be independent of the individual countries in question. South Korea does host several UN-related organizations already, so Korea could be a candidate location, I think, for a permanent secretariat, although there are a lot of other countries that could be candidates as well, especially since you want, I think anyway, I'm assuming that a group of countries around the world can have a shared understanding of what counts for democracy and substantively how to work to advance those kinds of goals, and that's another long conversation, but assuming that enough countries think this is worth continuing, it is important for the summit to have a kind of structure to it and a permanent body that will allow it to outlast the presidents and prime ministers of any individual nation state. So a secretariat is one step, and this is probably the right time to start looking into that and pursuing it. I know some organizations such as Freedom House have been advancing that. A couple of other steps that have been recommended as well. One would be for the countries participating to be asked to make specific commitments at how they are going to work to strengthen democracies from within. Basically, the idea that every country coming, and to avoid hypocrisy or minimize charges that here you are claiming to be a great democracy, but what about all the issues you have at home? What would individual countries do to try to strengthen and sustain democracy within their own spaces first, and then have a way for those countries to be accountable to delivering on those commitments. And then further, there's, democracy is a lot more than just government officials and elected representatives talking to each other. What makes a democracy ultimately, even in an age when most of the government will operate by representation, ultimately it's also participation by the people. And strong civil society organizations, strong citizens groups that are operating independently of the marketplace, independently of the state, and create this so-called third space for everyday people to actually have their voices projected into what comes out of government down the road. So there have been a lot of efforts by the organizers of the summit to bring in civil society representatives, both virtually and maybe this year in person. But there's a lot more that can be done in that regard. And I think that would also have a strengthening effect on the summit in the years to come.
Right, hopefully. Upon the birth of the Summit for Democracy, Professor Min, quite a number of people spoke about how global democracy was at threat. Now, speaking within your capacity as a scholar, do you believe global democracy is under tangible threat as we speak?
Yes, personally, I think that global democracy is declining nowadays. As you know, the world has experienced COVID-19, Ukraine war, and Israel-Hamas war. And few expected that we could see the situation where conventional wars could break out in the 21st century, 2020. It's a shocking news we got. And as a result of unexpected, irrational incidents, skepticism about democracy is growing around the world. And people want to have strong leaders who would restore law and order in their territory and secure their own interests against other countries in the global community. And we can find such a trend from public opinion polls. Recently, Pew Research Center survey showed that 59% of respondents answered that they are not satisfied with the way democracy works. And in addition, the percentage of the respondents who answered that the current representative democratic system is very good, the percentage is decreased by 5 to 10% in even democratic countries like UK, Germany, Japan, Italy, and South Korea compared to 2017. Meanwhile, the percentage of respondents who answered that I prefer a government system that their strong leader makes decisions without being checked by Congress or courts, that percentage increases significantly compared to 2017. Surprisingly, 12% increase in South Korea, 10% increase in Germany, and another 12% increase in India. And as you know, about 40 countries are supposed to hold the presidential and congressional elections this year. So I wonder if and how much such changes in the voter perception about democracy could affect the results of the upcoming elections around the world. I'm really worried about that.
That really is the big question right now. Professor Schattle, do you, regardless of all the difficulties we face at the moment, do you suppose the presence of such platforms like the Summit for Democracy is perhaps a step in the right direction to better promoting democratic principles?
Oh, absolutely. The more that we bring people together to reaffirm commitments to democracy, but also try to think critically about how democracy can be improved and what kinds of innovations we can make to take democracy, we could say, to a higher level of evolution. It's very, very important. So, this endeavor is certainly worth continuing. One area that I would highlight personally is a kind of next frontier, so to speak, for thinking about further democratic innovations. There's been a lot of work in my field in political science on the idea of deliberative democracy, working between representation and participation. Let's face it, most everyday people, go about, live their lives in large societies and generally don't get that involved in political life, except for when it comes time to vote. Or maybe they're involved in a community group in their neighborhood, but they're not actively engaged in, say, a major political issue, say on the environment, or say on poverty or workers' rights. I mean, people will get drawn into these big issues depending on what kind of work they do, but day to day there's not a lot of involvement. So one idea that political theorists have really been working on is to create more citizens' assemblies. For instance, in the US, we could easily, well maybe not easily, but we could feasibly set up a citizens' assembly that could act as a kind of third chamber in the US Congress. Or we could do the same in Korea. Korea has a one-chamber National Assembly. There are ways in which the basis of representation could be worked out through random selection, very similar to public opinion polling, where you could take a randomly selected group of citizens that would be a good representation of the general public in Korea, people that would be willing to serve, not by getting elected, but by being selected, almost like jury duty. And then having these selected representatives, once they're chosen, participate. And it gives the general public another way of getting involved, other than just having the usual electoral politics. And at times, even in Korea, there have been a couple of citizens' assemblies that have taken up key issues. One of them had to do with the siting of a nuclear power plant on the East Coast. So in Northern Europe, this has been growing as a trend. In Australia, it's been growing. They're not perfect. There was even a global citizens' assembly on climate issues. It's not well known, that panel, but it was an offshoot of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I think if there were more space at the Summit for Democracy to take ideas like citizens' assemblies and think more about how they could be operationalized favorably. What can we do to take the bugs out of citizens' assemblies that have existed so far and try to bring that further in to democratic processes? And could strengthening citizens' assemblies possibly serve as a way in which more people, especially younger people, could express more confidence down the road in democracies? Because as Professor Min pointed out, a lot of the public opinion polling is quite grim, suggesting that younger people are losing confidence in democracy. So in a way, we have a choice. We either have to keep hobbling along as we are, or risk erosion of democracy, or think about innovation. And I think the summit's function should be to push the innovation side.
For more perhaps civil engagement then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Professor Min, domestically then, what are South Korea's priorities to perhaps further promote its democracy?
Well, we can see the various ways of promoting democracy at home. And one of the big advantages that South Korean society has got is the well-activated civil society. And we got a pretty good tradition of activating civil society, and we got the pretty good political history experience in terms of taking the power back from the dictators to the hands of the mass or the public. So the South Korea has got a pretty good history of the civil society, and it's about time to activate the civil society's roles in terms of dealing with the everyday political problems, like what the East Coast, the nuclear power plants problems and other things, and activating that kind of the grassroots to the democratic tradition could be one of the ways that promote the democracy in South Korea. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, to date, we got a pretty tough the trend around the world. Strongmen dominate the political arena throughout the world. So it's not easy to overcome such kind of the environment. But anyway, it's about time to a little bit more seriously talk about how we reactivate the civil society in terms of promoting the democracy around the world, and including South Korea.
Right, indeed. Professor Schattle, speaking as a foreign scholar here in South Korea, what is your perhaps general assessment of South Korea's own democracy?
Well, let me say, first of all, Sunny, that every democracy has difficulties. No democracy in the history of the world has ever been perfect. You know, ancient Athens had slavery. The U.S. in its early years had slavery. You know, students in the U.S. learn about the Civil War. I'm sure students learn about it here too. And the U.S. is still struggling with issues of racial justice and also struggling for full inclusion. I mean, the history of American citizenship in many ways is a struggle, you know, for 200 years of groups that were excluded from the original political system, women who couldn't vote, African Americans that were excluded, other ethnic minorities that were excluded, and continuing to fight for that inclusion. So Korea, of course, has its struggles as well. One area of concern here, I think, currently is press freedom and openness to the media. Even though there's so many media outlets here, and generally that's a sign of a healthy democracy, there's also concern about persistent government interference on the management, the administration of news organizations, especially broadcasters. So that's one area of concern. There have been raids on the homes and the offices of journalists at times critical of the present government. So that's another point of concern. Defamation lawsuits are fairly easy to file in Korea. In the U.S., say, the First Amendment, which gives journalists a lot of space to report critically on public officials. Most countries don't have provisions quite that airtight, so that's been an issue in Korea as well. Globally, for press freedom, South Korea ranked 47th in 2023 on the list kept by the international organization Reporters Without Borders. That's not terrible. You know, that's out of 200 countries, so it puts South Korea still in the top 25% or so. But you know, this country often aims to be in the top 10 or the top 10% for the league table. So that's definitely a growth area that the government should be aware of and should give, you know, have enough confidence in the society to have the space to air coverage critically. And there's also a lot of concern, I think, in this country over the rights of women, the rights of LGBT minorities, the rights of refugees and migrants. And one thing I really like, you asked as an international resident here in Korea, one thing I've always liked about being in Seoul is on any given day you can be walking down near Gwanghwamun and see protesters, often protesters on different sides of the political spectrum out expressing their voices. We think back to the candlelight revolutions in 2016 and the peaceful transfer of power that emerged at that point after a serious presidential scandal. So the rule of law here got through that crisis in 2016, and I think that was actually a very important moment where after at that point South Korea had been fully democratic, we could say, for about a generation, and that was a real test, and the country passed that test. So that is very important, but there are always steps that can be taken to try to strengthen the rule of law and human rights and full inclusion of citizens here.
Right, indeed, of course. Professor Schattle, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you for having me, Sunny.
Right, and Professor Min, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.